such a reality, realitate, that is objectivity. So with the completion of the syllogistic form in the disjunctive syllogism with objective universality, we are also necessarily moved to a new determination of the concept. We were moved to reality or objectivity. But what does objectivity mean here? And most importantly, why does the completion of the syllogism entail that the concept here has now gained or won reality, that the concept is now objectivity? So let's consider both those questions. So the completion of the syllogistic form we've already talked about, right? It's brought us to that moment where there's no difference between the form of the process and the process itself, right? They're one. So that's what the collapse of the mediated relationship is all about. But then he says, because of that, not only have we reached, as I said repeatedly before the break, now have we reached the completion of the syllogistic forms or all the formal determinations of the concept. But he says we've also, by virtue of that same moment, not some additional one, not some 3 additional premises, and we were led to this conclusion, but by virtue of that same entailment, we've reached objectivity. So what do we even mean by objectivity? Well, objectivity here means roughly that we've reached the in and for itself, right? We've reached things as they are now, not formally, but as they are in being itself, in and for itself. So if that's right, if that makes some sense, then we can begin to make some sense then of those lines we were looking at before the break back on 527, where he draws that, where he makes that claim about, one with the matter at issue, the concept is submerged into the matter itself. The differences are objective determinations of existence in which it is itself again, the inner, that line there. So he says that in objectivity, 3 things he's saying in that passage, right? He says about objectivity that the status of the concept in objectivity is that of submergence. It's constricted. It's roughly speaking unfree. One with the matter at issue, he says, the concept is submerged, versenkt, right? It's sunken in, submerged into it. Its differences are objective determinations of existence in which it is itself again the inner. So the concept is here buried, once again now, in objectivity itself. Then the second claim he wants to make is, well, there's a necessity of the concept coming to be itself, not unfree, but free, in and through this domain, the domain of objectivity. So he says, as the soul of objective existence, it must give itself, there's that notion of freedom, right? Give itself the form of subjectivity that it immediately had as formal concept. So now it must show itself, prove itself to be syllogistic, simple way of putting it. And then the process here, third claim, there's a process of becoming free then in and through objectivity that pervades, that goes across the whole of this chapter on objectivity. And so he says there in that passage, in the form of the free concept, which in objectivity it still lacked, it steps forth over against objectivity. And over against it, it makes therein the identity with it, which is objective concept it has in and for itself, also an identity that is also posited, also something that it's achieved, also something that's brought about. So how can you have something, the concept be submerged in objectivity, and then distinguish itself from objectivity, and then in and through that objectivity come to prove itself to be free? That's the problematic of the chapter. Now, I submit that one of the most important notions here is a distinction that Hegel draws on 629 through, it's really on 629 through 630. When he first introduces the notion of objectivity, he says, we're talking about the Sache, the fact, the matter itself. We're talking about being, we're talking about reality. So he uses all those terms for it. But when he wants to get more precise about really what objectivity is, he draws this distinction that he lays out on 629. This is 131 in the German. He says this, middle paragraph on 629. Mention was made in connection with the apodictic judgment, where judgment attains completion and the subject thus loses its determinateness as against the predicate, of the double meaning of subjectivity originating from it, namely the subjectivity of the concept and equally so of the externality and contingency confronting the concept. So he's just reminding you, we've done the twofoldness of subjectivity, now twofoldness of objectivity. A similar objectivity also appears for the double meaning of standing opposed to the self-subsistent concept, yet of also existing in and for itself. So notice what he says, as opposed to the self-subsistent concept, that's one sense of objectivity, that which stands over against the concept, and that which is existing in and for itself. In the former sense, he says, the object stands opposed to the I equals I. So we know this sense of objectivity is like the subject-object divide. But here, there's not a subject, there's the concept. So it's that over against which the concept defines itself. Which in subjective idealism is declared to be the absolute truth. We're not subjective idealists. It is then the manifold world, and it's then in subjective idealism, it is the manifold world, he's talking about Fichte and Kant here, in its immediate existence with which the I or the concept is engaged in endless struggle, in order by the negation of the inherent nullity of this other to give to its first certainty of being a self the actual truth of its equality with itself. In a broader sense, it means, the sense of objectivity, means a subject matter in general for whatever interest or activity of the subject. So that's as it is standing over against it in the former sense. But then he says, in the opposite sense, in the latter sense, in the sense in which objectivity is not over against the concept, but the sense in which it is in and for itself. He says, the objective, next paragraph down, signifies that which exists in and for itself, without restriction and opposition. Rational principles, perfect works of art, are said to be objective to the extent that they are free and above every accidentality. So he draws that distinction. Then look at what he does on the next page with the distinction. First full paragraph down on 630, page 131 in the German. At the present standpoint of our treatise, objectivity has the meaning, first of all, of the being in and for itself of the concept. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems off to me, right? When you first read it, you think, oh, we're going to talk about the concept battling with objectivity. Absolutely not, right? Where you start off with is, as he said earlier, the concept submerged in objectivity. So what is it then? Objectivity as being in and for itself. The being in and for itself of the concept that has sublated the mediation posited in its self-determination, raising it to immediate self-relation. This immediacy is therefore itself immediately and entirely pervaded by the concept, just as its totality is immediately identical with its being. But further, since the concept equally has to restore the free being for itself of its subjectivity. This is the same lines we saw in the plan earlier, right? How do we get to this? We have to get to this moving from the in and for itself of being to something other than that. So he says, it enters to restore the free being for itself of its subjectivity. It enters with respect to objectivity into a relation of purpose, Zweck, teleology. So he's telling you there, look, here's what's about to happen. We're going to go on a journey. That journey is roughly this. The concept, which has already proven itself to be syllogistic to the core, that's the process that it runs. Disjunctive syllogism is the ultimate expression of that. That has now entailed objectivity. And the objectivity it has entailed is being in and for itself. Completely distinct from, other than, but also not in relation to the concept. The concept is buried, submerged in it. There is nothing else. There is nothing else. But that concept, as we've already seen, has a structure. That's a process that has a structure. So that structure is going to work itself out now, literally in objectivity. And the way it's going to work itself out is it's going to work itself through being in and for itself, objectivity in that sense, something that stands on its own. But it's going to eventually show itself to be other than that. So now objectivity becomes that first sense, being something that's other than the concept. And when it does that, it becomes a purpose, something it can use, instrumentality, something that is for the sake of. The world now being becomes for the sake of the concept. He says, a relation of purpose in which the immediacy of the objectivity becomes a negative for it, for the concept, something other than the concept, something to be determined through the concept's activity. So it uses it, right? It makes use of it. This immediacy thus acquires the other significance, namely in and for itself, insofar as it stands opposed to the concept, it is a nullity. So it's that first sense of objectivity, as he calls it back here, of standing opposed to the self-subsistent concept. Now it stands opposed to the self-subsistent concept, something to be used by the concept. But that's in teleology. So now he gives you the entire setup of the chapter on objectivity, mechanism, chemism, teleology, precisely in those terms. Look at what he says. First, then, objectivity is in its immediacy. Now, caution, when we hear immediacy, we think immediate to someone, right? It's immediate to me. What he means is it's in its most barest determination. It's being in and for itself. Its moments, on account of the totality of all moments, stand in self-subsistent indifference as objects each outside the other. This is Hegel's favorite way of talking about what he's about to call mechanism. Mechanism is for him objects in relation to one another, where the relations are all extrinsic external relations. That's what he means by mechanism. He doesn't mean a fully mechanistic worldview like we tend to, import into this. He means by it nothing more than this, where the objects are in relation to one another, but they're indifferent to their relation to one another. Because he says, and as so related, they possess the subjective unity of the concept only as inner or as outer. It doesn't matter because it's extrinsic to them. This is mechanism. But second, inasmuch as in mechanism, that unity reveals itself to be the immanent law of the objects, more about this further on, their relation becomes one of non-indifference. Catch that, right? We move from indifference in mechanism of the mechanical objects in relation to one another to their differential relation. It matters to them. Each specifically different according to law, a connection in which the object's determinate self-subsistence is sublated. They can't stand on their own anymore. This is chemism. So notice chemism's difference than mechanism is simply one of relationality matters intrinsically to the objects. Whereas it didn't, it made no difference. It was a difference that was there, but some difference that made no difference in mechanism. Third, this essential unity of the objects is thereby posited as distinct from their self-subsistence. It is a subjective concept, but posited as referring, relating, and in for itself to the objectivity as purpose. So purpose now relates to objectivity. That means it stands separate from them. So we've just moved from being in and for itself in both mechanism and chemism to being as standing opposed to the concept. That's teleology. Then he says, since purpose is the concept posited as within it relating to objectivity, and through itself sublating its defect of being subjective, the at first external purposiveness becomes, through the realization of this purpose, internal. It becomes idea. Well, that we'll get to when we get there, right? But he's clearly drawing a distinction between what he calls external teleology, which will be the subject matter here in objectivity, and internal teleology, which is what the idea will at least be dealing with. And there we'll call it life, right? Because that's what the life chapter is. It's about internal teleology, where it's not objectivity separate from the concept and at the behest for the sake of the concept. It's actually the concept in objectivity itself, but now as explicitly informing and engendering that objectivity itself. All right. Now, if that makes a little bit of sense, we'll come back and constantly reference those to try to make sense along the way. I do want to say one other thing in preparation for going through mechanism and chemism a little bit here, as a kind of preparatory introduction to it. So let me say that because I think it's important to think about what's going on here, right? There's a tendency when you read this chapter to think, oh, it's talking about mechanism, chemism, and teleology. So those are separable domains. So there are mechanical things, mechanical processes, there are chemical things and chemical processes, and there are teleological things and there are teleological processes. And he's categorically or categorizing the world separable from one another. So objectivity is the world, right? At its most fundamental, basic level. We haven't got nature, we haven't got spirit, we haven't got time, we haven't got any of those things that come with all of that. But we've got this, it is, and its isness, right? It's being, it's qualitative, quantitative, has this measurability about it. All that stuff's true. But we're saying, well, there's mechanical dimensions to it, there's chemical dimensions to it, and there's teleological dimensions to it. I think that's a bad way to read the chapter. It suggests that there's like the mechanical domain, there's the chemical domain, and then there's this other third domain called the teleological domain. I think the best way to read the chapter is it's one world. It has a mechanical dimension, it has a chemical dimension, and it has a teleological dimension, and it's all still one world. So think about it. Hegel doesn't express it this way, but I think it's what he means is we're going to start with the most basic layer of being, the most basic layer. So, as I've said many times, the objectivity chapter is, in a sense, Hegel going back and rereading being in essence. Going back and rereading those from the processional logic now laid out as the logic of the concept. right? So it's not about relations now. It's not about how qualitative and quantitative determinations get into relation with one another in measure. It's not about that. It's what undergirds that, which is a process known as mechanism. So at the most basic rudimentary layer of objectivity, the most basic rudimentary layer of being, of all that is, are these mechanical objects and processes. And then on top of that is another layer. It's those same objects, those same processes, now understood chemically. Right? So there's a chemical dimension to them as well. And that same set of objects, that same set of processes is also going to be teleological. So they're not three different domains, right? We leave the mechanical domain and we arrive in the chemical domain, and then we left that and went over to the That's not how Hegel thinks of this. It's one world, three different determinations of the one world and its set of objects and processes. So yes, they are mechanical. Yes, they're chemical, but yes, they're also the same set of objects, the same domain. One domain is teleological. So you don't have to sort your objects out. Is that a mechanical object? Is that a chemical object? Oh, is that a it's not, it's just one world, right? So all those objects and all those processes have those three different dimensions going on with them. So the way I put this is one set of objects, one process, three progressively more determinate layers or strata of determination. As the objectivity of the concept, this set of objects and this process are all governed by the determinations of the concept. They're all going to be about universality, particularity, singularity. That is to say, each form of objectivity is a specific way in which universality, particularity, and singularity define those objects and that process by virtue of the way in which they are related to one another. So the set of objects and the process don't just incorporate syllogistic configurations, that is, syllogistic structures. They actually are nothing other than those syllogisms. So here's the point about, they're not like syllogisms, they are syllogisms. Mechanism necessarily and imminently entails chemism, and chemism in turn necessarily and imminently entails teleology. Both mechanism and chemism thus prove to be constitutive moments of the process of teleology, right? So it's not a separable domain. They're all part and parcel of, it's one world, right? It's one set of objects, one process. So teleology thus will make use of objects. It's instrumental, right? So we'll make use. These things are for the sake of the concept, is what it'll eventually prove out to be. And its own process as mechanically and chemically determined as parts of its own operation. So it's going to make use of the mechanistic and chemical dimensions of the world in a teleological, instrumental fashion. For that to be possible, the analyses of mechanism, chemism, and teleology must establish that these determinations are commensurate rather than incommensurate determinations. So they have to be reconcilable with one another. So this can't be, mechanistic over here, chemical, some kind of secondary place in the world, and then the teleological domain is over here. In other words, we can't have that problem that Kant has in the third critique. How do I reconcile mechanism and teleology? At least that's one way, that's the way it was thought of. I think that's the best way to think of the Kantian side of it, but that's how it was read post-Kantian, right? Is that he's trying to reconcile the first critique mechanism with the second critique's dependence on teleology. We act for purposes. How do you reconcile those two together? And Hegel's going to never allow the two to be separated like that, right? Because he's committed from the very beginning to it's one world, it's one set of objects, it's one process. They're mechanistic, they're chemical, and they're teleological all together from the outset. So those analyses of mechanism, chemism, and teleology must establish that these determinations, each one of those kinds of determinations, are commensurate rather than incommensurate with one another. That is to say, the mechanical and chemical determinations of objects and processes must thus be such that they are determinable by and admit of being determined by, as we shall see, extrinsic but ultimately intrinsic ends. So extrinsic at first in external teleology, but intrinsic ends when we get to life. So again, here, just a reminder of what we mean by teleology here. So, you'll be disappointed if you want to go find out what does Hegel mean by teleology and think that you're talking about kind of the big view of Hegel as a teleologist, right? And you go to this chapter and all he ever talks about is external teleology, how one thing is for the sake of another thing, which is not the way we were talking about teleology usually. So you'll be disappointed. What it really is all about is about how the end or purpose, which is the Zweck, which turns out to be the concept, and the reality in which it realizes itself, that's the two in relationship to one another, that only arises in teleology and defines it. And that emerges at the end of chemism, where the concept now stands over against objectivity. It's not just submerged in it, it frees itself from it. That's external purposiveness, external teleology, because the end or purpose stands over against the objectivity in which it realizes itself. While in internal teleology, life, the end or purpose is born immanently within the objectivity in which it's realized. Here, the concept will not be the purpose, it'll be life itself. All right. That makes some general sense. So one world, one process, one set of objects, mechanistically, chemically, and teleologically determined, and show how one entails the next. That's what we're after, and to see how the concept really is at work in all of them, right? Is how the concept not just is at work in them, but actually produces all of them. Produces mechanical objects and processes, chemical objects and processes, and ultimately teleological objects and processes. All right. Then let's talk about mechanism a little bit here. Mechanism denotes a relationship between objects where these entities, you could also call them events, but he tends to call them objects and entities, so I'll stay with that language, but they are occurrences, right? They happen, are indifferent to one another. Now, I think it's always useful to start from that because that's the way Hegel thinks about mechanism in general. No matter what domain he's talking about in, whether he's talking about natural mechanics, spiritual mechanics, any form of, when he invokes the notion of mechanics, invariably that's what he means. He doesn't mean everything else. He doesn't mean, matter in motion is static and has to be hit by another, the billiard ball model of a Newtonian mechanics. He doesn't mean all that. He just simply means objects are indifferent to one another. They're related, but the relation doesn't actually matter to their determination. Their relations to one another have absolutely no bearing on what each object is because they're completely determined in and through themselves alone. They are singularities, we could say, to use the conceptual determinations. They're pure singularities. They're monads, the term he starts using for it. Now, clearly borrowed from Leibniz, but doesn't mean the same thing that Leibniz meant by it. Typical Hegel. Love the term, right? The oneness, right? He's going for the monadic. It's oneness unto itself. But what that means for Hegel is not what it means for Leibniz, because Leibniz thought, oh, the concept is completely determined in the monad. Hegel's going to say, well, that's the universality being completely particularized in that singularity. So mechanical relations, they're extrinsic, right? They're there. Mechanical objects do have a bearing on one another. It just doesn't make them what they are. So it's extrinsic relations, wholly. They determine objects, but they can do so only externally or extrinsically. All mechanical relations are wholly external, extrinsic relations. They do not affect the mechanical objects, the bodies qua monads, as such. They thus form a manifold. Hegel calls this on 632. A manifold, a composite, an aggregate. The mechanical process, so that's the mechanical objects. They form an aggregate, right, of a collection, a heap, to use the Aristotelian technical term, right? It's a heap. It's a bunch of stuff thrown together without any intrinsic determinations with respect to one another. It's a composite, an aggregate, not a totality, not a coherent totality. And there's also a mechanical, so that's the mechanical objects, but there's also a mechanical process at work here. It's a kind of causality, he says, whereby one entity is determined by another entity. So here's where we kind of rush to put in, oh, that's Newtonian matter in motion. And Hegel will say, back off of that, because I'm not just talking about matter in motion. That'll show up in the philosophy of nature, absolutely, but not here. I'm just talking about at the rudimentary level, underlying even that, those natural determinations. So even undergirding or underlying what Newtonian mechanics tells us about is this. There is a process at work, a kind of causality, where one body impacts another body in a way that's completely indifferent to their respective nature. Doesn't change their constitutions, he says. They still are what they are. So after their collisions, their impacts, their interactions with one another, doesn't change a damn thing about them. That's mechanical causality. That's mechanical objects interacting with one another. He refers to that non-intrinsically determining impact as communication. Strange term for this, right? Mitteilung, right? Mitteilung, sharing of one thing with another, right? Bringing the separation together, right? Brings them in communication, translated that way. So he calls it this on 635. Take a look on 635. This is under the formal mechanical process, he calls it follows from this, the just indicated concept that the interaction of objects is the positing of their identical connection. This positing consists simply in giving to the determinants, which is generated the form of universality. And this is communication, which occurs without transition into the object. Then he starts giving you a bunch of examples of it. Rare in Hegel to give you examples, but he gives you them here. Spiritual communication, which however takes place in an element of universality. So he doesn't go immediately to mechanistic, causality like we think about it in Newtonian science, right? He says spiritual communication, which however takes place in an element of universality in the form of universality, is an idealized connection for itself, one in which a determinant continues undisturbed from one person to another. This is about speaking, right? That's what he's talking about, speaking to one another. You're communicating in that sense. That's a form of this. But it's also, that's one form of it. There's multiple other forms of it as well. So that's what he calls the formal mechanical process, communication. So entities, insofar as they are mechanical, undergo communication in common. They all are afflicted, if you want to put it in those terms. They all suffer impact from other objects. Just what I'm doing right now for Hegel is an example of it. I'm communicating with you. I'm speaking words, and they're butting up against you. And I imagine most of them are going, I don't really want to hear that, right? Because that doesn't really, so you're indifferent to it, right? Welcome to mechanical relations, right? That's what's going on. The words are going out there, but they're not making any difference that you're being communicated to, but the impact is not internal. I'm not criticizing. You're just mechanistic. Let's say that's not a criticism. Okay. The formal mechanical process is distinctive in that it always and necessarily leaves the objects that it brings into an impactful relationship. It leaves them with one another as they were logically before their interaction. Right? It's an impact that makes no difference. The result of the formal mechanical process, Hegel says, he says this on 638. He says at the top of, right under the real mechanical process, we'll get to the real, but he's summarizing the formal. He says, the mechanical process passes over into rest, right? It's impacts that don't change anything. That's what he means by rest here. Peace, ruah. Right? It's just rest. And he says from there, the real mechanical process as opposed to the formal was communication. The real is something different. It's distribution, he says, not communication, but distribution. Vermittlung. So the real mechanical process follows from the formal mechanical process, and that what is communicated in the formal process, though remaining wholly extrinsic to the objects, is nonetheless distributed among the entities with respect to the singularity of each object. So it impacts all of them. They all have been impacted by it, even though that hasn't changed them internally. They've all been impacted. So they do, here we go, share that. All mechanical objects, insofar as they've been communicating with one another, impacting one another in a whole range of ways, means that they all share something in common, that they've been impacted by this process. It hasn't changed them, right? They're singularities, but now they've got something that they share in common. They're all equally indifferent, and they're opposed to one another, although that opposition to one another hasn't really been made explicit yet. That's what will define chemism, by the way. But here, they're indifferent still to one another. So he writes on 638. This is right in the middle of 638. 638 right in the middle. Yeah. So take a look at the paragraph begins, now further, since the determinant is a positive one, 638, this is page 140 in the German. Everybody see where I'm at? And he writes, so drop down to the next sentence down, the next full sentence. Hence, in the mechanical process, the objects in the process itself now have a more closely determined relation. Not internal yet, right? But, it's more impactful. So it's done something to them, not internally to them, to the objects, but it's something they share in common. They are not merely diverse, but are determined differentiated as against one another. So they're opposed to one another, right? But that's not yet endemic to any of them. Consequently, the result of the formal process, on the one hand, a determinantless rest, is, on the other hand, through the imminently reflected determinants, the distribution among several objects mechanically relating to one another of the opposition which is in the object as such. He says the object that on the one hand lacks all determination, showing no elasticity and no self-subsistence in its relations, has, on the other hand, a self-subsistence impenetrable to other objects. So that's what they share, impenetrability. Their indifference is the difference maker, right? They're all differentially related as indifferent to one another. Objects now also have as against one another this more determined opposition of the self-subsistent singularity and the non-self-subsistent universality. Okay, we can start picking up something here. Mechanical objects, we haven't got to material. Mechanical objects are indifferent, they're singulars, they're monads. They impact one another. So we're in a world initially, we're in this first layer of objectivity. Things impact one another as singularities. They're monads butting up against one another, interacting with one another in a multitude of different ways. And this is what we call their communication with one another. But it also distributes amongst them. So that's the formal side of the process they're undergoing. But the real mechanical process that they're undergoing also, so it's formal and real. The real mechanical process is that it establishes between all of them a relationship of opposition. They're impenetrable to one another. That's their opposition. But that opposition is extrinsic. It doesn't define any of that singularity. So it is a feature, this should start to sound familiar, that they all share, that they all bear. This is qualitative universality. They have singularity, yes, but the universality they share is a feature that each one of them has, like red. They're all opposed to one another, but that opposition is not intrinsic to them. It's a feature of them, but it's not intrinsic to their singularity itself. So objects, insofar as they are mechanical, are thus defined by, we could say, a fundamental contradiction. Hegel will constantly come back to this and say, the objects are two things at once. So they're self-contradictory. Here's this logic of, we've moved from absolute indifference to diversity to contradiction, from opposition to contradiction. What we saw in the logic of essence, right? The movement of that account. So he says, they are resistant. So here's the contradiction. They are resistant in that they stand self-subsistently indifferent. They are self-subsistent universality. Yet to be seized or invaded, communicated to, and distributed by another, they have a non-self-subsistent, you could say qualitative universality, a shared property inherent form of universality. This is not a class universality. Yes? Because it's not something extractable from them. It's a feature they all bear of themselves, but it's not an intrinsic feature, it's an extrinsic feature. The process of distribution of universality into singularity, that's what real mechanical process is, remains extrinsic. It occurs in the monads, it occurs to the monads, but not from any of them. It happens to them, but it's not their doing, and it doesn't change their constitution internally. They remain self-subsistent unto themselves. They could be what they were before these interactions. They could be what they are before these impacts of the process has on them at all. Now, if we stop there for just a moment, right? Hegel does not do what I'm about to say. So I want to be clear and distinguish what I'm saying from what he himself does. But I think it's an implication of what he does do in this chapter, that account, that basic rudimentary account, which we've got to go on further to see more developed, and we'll see it more developed. That basic account of mechanical objects and mechanical processes, both the formal and the real nature of the mechanical processes, and the ways in which they're all singulars that bear a kind of shared universality. And that shared universality is something that is a feature of all of them, namely they're opposed to one another. They're each self-sufficient unto themselves. That is all the basis for qualitative determinations, quantitative determinations, and measure in the logic of being. All those determinations, the quality, quantity, and measure in the logic of being, happen to these kinds of objects. Now, we know that quality and quantity eventually have to come into relation. That's what measure is. So, it's relation between states of objects. And that's what we're talking about now. that are indifferent to one another, but they won't be completely indifferent to one another overall. But this is where we start. So mechanism, as far as I can tell, Hegel doesn't make these connections, so please be careful here. Mechanism lays the basis for the logic of being. The logic of being then is a higher level determination of the mechanistic layer that undergirds and makes it possible. If the truth of being is essence, the truth of essence is the concept. Here's the concept being the truth of being itself. So we could say then that the result of the mechanical process qua formal communication is the resolute rest and peace of each and every entity with respect to every other entity. They all sit there. Each object is thus an indeterminate universality unto itself, which is to say each object is itself particular. So it's got all three determinations. Each object is each determination where singularity is the predominant determination. And yet, as a result of the mechanical process qua real, so distribution, each and every object becomes a genuinely objective singular, the positive totality of the concept, the positive reflection of it into itself. Each one of them has these three moments within it, so it's got all the concept there. It's just that singularity is the dominating moment. So the oneness of all objects, their shared distributed universality, their, we could say, qualitative universality, as self-subsistence, that's what their universality is itself an individual self-subsistence. He calls this on 640 the center. The center, absolute mechanism, bottom page, the center, the middle point. Now, it's always odd because there's actually not a middle point, right? There's not some, here's where they all coalesce around. It's not what to think about a middle point here. The middle point just literally is the center. It's a center that's completely distributed across all the objects. It's something they all share, but it's nothing unto itself. It's not a concept. It's not, better said, a class. It's shared out. So mechanism, no huge surprise, is qualitative universality, where singularity, so the syllogisms of existence are all going to be principled here. We'll look at them in just a moment where he does this. He'll take it out of simply existence. It'll go into reflection as well, but we'll talk about how that works. So insofar as this universality, that is the center, is nothing other than its distribution to all of its objects, this universality particularizes itself from within. He calls this the law. Take a look on 640, the second full paragraph down. He says, the result product of formal mechanism is the object in general, an indifferent totality in which determinateness is as posited. The object has thereby entered the process as a determinate thing, and in the extinction of this process, the result is on the one hand, rest, the original formalism of the object, the negativity is determinants for itself. But on the other hand, it is the sublation of the determinants, the positive reflection of it into itself, the determinants that is withdrawn into itself, or the positive totality of the concept of true singularity. So they're all singulars, monads are singulars, of the object determined as first in its indeterminate universality, then as particular, is now determined as objective singular, not objective universality, objective singular. So that in it, that reflective semblance of singularity, which is only a self-subsistence, opposing itself to the substantial universality, is sublated. It's all born within it. And that's what he means by the law. The law is just this process, just names this process of everything is what it is by virtue of being distinct from everything else, without that distinctness being intrinsic to any of their determinations. Now, at that point, take a look on 642. Hegel then begins this pattern that we'll see continue in chemism. And it's this pattern of saying, okay, I've laid this out. I've laid an account of the mechanistic layer of objectivity being in and for itself. I've laid it out. It's these objects and their indifferent relations to one another in the formal sense of communication and the real sense of distribution. And they have a law by which they have a center, but that center, the center is nothing unto itself. It's completely distributed in singularities. He says, well, those are syllogisms. They're not like syllogisms, they are syllogisms. So he lays them out for you. Look on 642. But the central individual is at first only a middle term that has yet no true extremes. So it starts with just the singular unto themselves, the monad unto itself. As the negative unity of the total concept, it derivs itself rather into such extremes. It gives rise to particularity, it gives rise to universality. a particularity that it has, a universality that it shares. Or again, the previously non-self-subsistent self-external objects become likewise determined as individuals by the retreat of the concept. The self-identity of the central body, still a striving, is burdened by an externality to which, in being taken up into the body's objective singularity, the latter is communicated. The objects through this centrality of their own are positioned outside the original center and are themselves centers for the non-self-subsistent objects. These second centers, the center within each object, and the non-self-subsistent objects are brought into unity by the absolute middle term. Confusing, but that is a form of syllogism, obviously. And he's saying it exists not just like it's in reality, it is reality. He then proceeds to give you a second and a third syllogism that are out there. Now, let's think about each one of these syllogisms for just a moment. The first one that he lays out on the top of 642, I think is fairly clearly identifiable insofar as these things are clear. Fairly clearly identifiable as the syllogism of existence in its third figure. The syllogism of existence in its third figure. The center, which is the universality, which is nothing unto itself, right? There is no universality unto itself here, gives way to the objects, the mechanical objects, which are the singulars and the particulars themselves then, who are the true center of the system. So there is no center other than the one that's distributed out to all the individual objects. Though these objects are what they are only as they possess and bear the center, the self-subsistence, as their defining property. So that's what makes that particularity, is what makes them the monads that they are, the singular that they are. Well, that's singularity joined to particularity through universality. The universality is here a qualitative universality. So straightforwardly, it's that. Right? It's SUP where the U here connects the particularity of being self-subsistent with these singular monadic objects through being born by, being within, or being a feature of each one of the objects themselves without the objects being determined by it internally or intrinsically. He then says something quite interesting in the next paragraph down. He says, the center, because it's all shared by each one of the objects, mechanical objects, the center that it is no center, the center that is self-subsistence, that feature, it doesn't just inhere in them. He says his language, subsumes them. So now we've moved from a syllogism of existence, which is inherence, to a syllogism of subsumption. I think it's the inductive syllogism, right? The syllogism, second figure of the syllogism, right? It's an inductive syllogism. The center subsumes the singular, but the objects in turn subsume those less than singulars. It subsumes the particular. So all this is being subsumed under and through this notion of induction. Right? It's all being joined up into, related to universality, where universality now has become, the center has become a kind of class concept. But then, just to make this clear, as much as you can here, the third syllogism he talks about here is another syllogism of reflection. It's not the inductive syllogism, it's the allness syllogism. So he actually goes back up one. Here's what he says is the third syllogism. It's the non-self-subsistent object, the particular. That's the middle term now that joins together the extremes of the singular objects and the universal center. So the universal center doesn't subsume everything directly. It subsumes them because they're particulars. The singular objects now strive after the center in and through their particularity. And notice what he did there, because that's an incredibly important little move, right? He just made. He started off by saying, hey, look, you want to know what the mechanical world's like? The mechanical dimension of the world is like? It's like this. Things are indifferent to one another. They're all singular monads. They have relation to one another, but those relations don't matter. They're all extrinsic. So do they impact one another? Of course they do. They communicate that to one another. Well, in that communication, does anything happen? No. Doesn't matter. It's a difference that doesn't matter. Right? It's a relation that doesn't matter. Except for the fact that in that same mechanical process, the communication, what's being established for each one of them, what's being distributed, shared out to each one of them, is their self-subsistence. What that mechanical process establishes is that they actually don't matter to one another. It's a strange claim, but that's exactly what he thinks, that mechanical relations are extrinsic, and one of the things that extrinsic relations do is they establish that things are extrinsic to one another. So that's something they all now share, their self-subsistence. Well, that's their center, that's no center, right? That's what they all share. That's their universality, their center that they all share. but it's nothing unto itself until, well, it is something that they all have a feature of, and therefore they can all be subsumed under. And because they can all be subsumed under that, their center now really is their organizing center. It's what subsumes them all. Then they are all striving. Here's the contradiction in them. They're striving on the one side to remain self-subsistent, but they're also striving to be self-subsistent at the same time. Right? They're being self-subsistent, but they're not, because they're being subsumed under universality. So what are they striving for? Well, to be themselves, but the only way they can strive to be themselves is to be a member of a class. There's their contradiction. To be self-subsistent, they can't be self-subsistent. Hegel's point then, ultimate point about the mechanistic dimension of objectivity, is that it's about indifference. It's indifferent to one another, but that's precisely what drives it to strive to be indifferent, but that's what drives it to be one. So the objects do not strive towards a middle point. There really is no middle point they're all trying to get, to collapse into. That's not what he's claiming. They're not, oh, now there's a center. They're all going to go there. No. They're all going to be self-subsistent. That's what they're all striving to be when they're all now related to one another. And that's their communication. That's their distribution. That's the process that involves them with one another. But now, that's something they're striving to have to be. So that striving is not striving to be subsumed under the center, because there is no center. Remember, there is no center. It's just this feature they all share. So what does it turn into? Hegel says very precisely, this striving turns into a tension between the objects. There is no center towards which they all strive. It simply turns into a tension. That's his first way of talking about this. A tensed relationship of one mechanical object with another. He says this on 645, beginning of the chemism chapter. The chemical object, this is 645, this is the 7 lines from the top. The chemical is right under the chemical object section. The chemical object differentiates itself from the mechanical. So it's always helpful to get these contrasts, right? The chemical object, which is just mechanical objects now thought of in a different way, now at a different level of dimension of determination. Not new. We didn't go to a new world called chemical world, right? Still the same world. The chemical object differentiates itself from the mechanical, and that the latter, mechanical, is a totality indifferent to determinateness. So there's the shorthand way of talking about what's the mechanical dimension of reality of objectivity like. It's indifferent to one another, right? It doesn't matter. All the relations are extrinsic. So he says, whereas in the chemical object, the determinateness, and hence the relation to other, and the mode and manner of this relation belong to its nature. Belong to its nature. So note what that means, or what I think that means. We've gone from a dimension of objectivity that is relational, processional, but fundamentally singular object pronounced and dominated. So the relations and the processes ultimately don't matter. They don't make a determinate difference. They don't determine those objects themselves. That's what we mean by indifference, yes? But what we've been able to show is if you play that out, right, if you just think through the logic of that, then ultimately that means that those objects can't be indifferent to their fellow objects. They have to be in tense relationships with one another because they're all trying to maintain their self-subsistence over against other things in their self-subsistence. What is their center? What is the universality they all share? Self-subsistence. Do they have that on their own? Well, initially it looks like they do in their singularity, but insofar as they share that, it's not a singular thing. It's something they all share as a universal feature. So that looks like it's going to subsume them all, second syllogism. But actually what that does is set them at odds with one another. So it sets them in a tensed relation to one another, where now they are separate from one another, yes, still, but the difference between them makes a difference. Their relations now make a difference. They have a relation to one another. We just walked out of being into the world of relations, the logic of essence. So Hegel is replaying pretty clearly, I think, is marking it by saying, look, here's the underlying world, the set of objects and processes that we talked about when we were talking about being. We were talking about being and becoming and all that kind of wonderful stuff and the relations and the qualitative determination, the quantitative determination, all that stuff. We were talking about these things at that level, but it was all relational. Here we're talking about it as why it's so relational. It's relational because these things don't want to have determinations. They want to stand on their own. And they're striving to do that over against one another ultimately. But that's what makes them no longer simply mechanical. It makes them also and inherently chemical. So chemical is Hegel's name for the mechanical objects and processes, now where those relations between those objects, which were singularities, monadic singularities, where those are now bear relationships to one another, and those relationships actually matter. They're not just extrinsic. Now we'll see how intrinsic they get, right? That's coming. But for the moment, we can say at least they're no longer simply extrinsic, no longer simply external. They're no longer set simply at odds with one another, where the odds don't matter. Now the odds seem to be mattering in some form, fashion, or another. It's a striving to be what they seem to just be without any striving at the beginning of mechanism. They all seem to be self-subsistent to their own. But if you work that out, the process of communication and distribution forces them to strive to be the thing that they were at the beginning, namely indifferent, singularities. Now they have to strive to be the singularities, to keep from being subsumed under this common feature they share with everything else, to stand out apart and singular, separate from their other mechanical objects and the processes between them. So chemism. Yes? Make a little sense? Please, yeah, fair.
I'm not sure about my question, but
No, go ahead.
anyway. Can you say it again, like the transition between mechanism to?
Yeah. No, I think this is incredibly important. So in general terms, let's start with the general terms and I'll kind of unpack it more in detail some. The general terms is we're going from mechanical layer to the chemical layer. What we mean by that is we're moving from let me use this term, a stratum that's defined by a set of singularities, mechanical objects, that do have processes that flow amongst them, that put them in, that impact one another, but the impacts don't matter. So it's where we have an indifferent set of objects, indifferent to one another, and indifferent to the processes that occur between them. That's where we started. But if you examine that more closely in terms of particularly the processes being both communicative, right? So they're impacting one another, and distributive, so the formal and the real, the distributive one is the more sort of ultimately significant, because what it does is it says they're all self-subsistent, but that means they all share that. So how singular are they? That, if I caricature it, I would say that threatens their singularity, right? They're now not standing on their own. They're actually threatened with, well, we all just, instances of a general class called self-subsistence, right? But that moment, it says each one of them has to strive to be self-subsistent. It can't just be indifferent and be self-subsistent. It's got to strive to maintain its own self-subsistence. But in doing that, it's not trying to strive to come under a subsumption in the center, the middle concept, because there is none, right? It's still a qualitative universality. There is no universality there for it to be subsumed under. So what is it really striving against? It's striving with its other mechanical objects, striving against them. So it puts them in a tensed, oppositional relationship to one another. And that means we're no longer in simple mechanical layer. We're now in the chemical layer where relations now matter. There were relations in the mechanical layer, yes, but they didn't matter. But they proved out ultimately to necessarily matter. And that's why we are out of mechanism into chemism. Does that help?
Yes. Can you clarify again? So if everything is absolutely independent, why do we interact or why do we communicate? Like, what is the internal drive of that communication, like the status of that.
Yeah, where did that ever get going?
Like, if, what is the first, where does the first cause?
Yeah.
From?
I love it.
Like,
No, it's great. So at this stage, we don't have an answer to that really, really important question. Now, no surprise, it's going to turn out to be the concept. But right now, we don't have an answer to that question. We don't know why there is communication. We don't know why there is this process of distribution. We just know that it's there, right? We don't yet have, as you rightly say, we don't yet know what does that, what brings that about, what, to use the term, causes that. What is the cause? We don't have a mechanical causality, right? So we don't have any kind of causality. We don't know what it means for communication to be, we know what it means, we know what it looks like. I'm doing it right now, according to Hegel. But we don't know what's producing that and why that's taking place. We just know that it's taking. Does that help?
Yeah.
So I think it's right to ask that question, but Hegel's going to say, we don't have the means within mechanism itself to answer that question. All we can see is we can observe these features, that there are singularities that to be singulars initially looks like they could do that on their own. They're just indifferent to anything else, so they stand on their own. And yeah, they come into contact with other things. You're asking, well, why do they? We don't have an account of that yet, but they do come into contact with one another. And what that, the formal side of that is just the impacts they have on one another, but the impact is not determinative of any of them, right? So they're connecting with one another, or they're interacting with one another, but it doesn't matter to them. It doesn't determine them. They're still singulars. But the real side of that, the real side of that same mechanical process, the distribution, it means, well, what's being distributed, what's being shared out between them in their impacts with one another is they all stand on their own. Well, I thought that's what they originally were. Well, it is, but also it isn't, because now they each have that. And that's been shared with them. So it's a feature they possess. It's a now not just a singular thing, it's a particular thing. And because it's a particular thing, it looks like they now have a universality that's inhering in them. Well, that for them to stand on their own, they can't be subsumed under one universality. What does that generate? It generates a tension between each one of them to stand on their own as a singular. So we moved from, they really didn't change all that much, right? They're still monads. But the difference between these monads, I mean, the standard old thing is, whereas Leibniz famously said the monads don't have windows, these monads have windows, right? Because they're burst open from within, because they're beset with the problem of they're singular, but they're universal at the same time. And they want to be able to stand on their own as singulars. And they can if they're universals. And that universal means they can be subsumed. So they strive, but they're not striving against some central class concept of universality. They're separating themselves because what they want to separate themselves off from is the other shared particulars that have this, which is other singular monads. So there's the tension, right? And the tension is their relationality. Now it's a relationality that matters to them. It's definitive even in some way of them. That's the difference between mechanism and chemism. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Yeah, please, Amir.
Just related to your last sentence.
Yeah.
How can we read the last thing you said? How can we apply that point to page 639, where he talks about power and resistance?
Yeah.
Relationality of power and resistance.
Yeah, so this is where he's going back to that language he used at the end of the actuality chapter, where he's talking about Mach and Gewalt, and that's the same language he's using here about power and violence, right? Gewalt is violence, Mach is power, obviously. And he's talking about here that we have that. So he draws a distinction. Let me just read the passage so we can know what we're talking about. He's talking about resistance, right? That's the general framework in which he's talking about this. So this is this moment where, where the monadic singulars of mechanical objects all want to stand unto themselves, but can't because they're also at the same point, not only singular, but universal. So they've got to resist one another, right? So this puts them in tension with one another, ultimately, as we've been talking about in the chemism. But then he says this, resistance, this is 639, the middle paragraph, resistance is the precise moment of the overpowering of the one object by the other, for it is the initial moment in the distribution of the communicated universal and in the positing of the self-relating negativity of the singularity to be established. So resistance is where one thing is overpowering another. It's where it's over. So that communication is not just that they impact one another, it's where one overtakes the other. So that's this moment of power. Both of them are contending. So here's their tense relationship. They're contending with one another. And where one becomes dominant, you have violence. So here's what he says. Look in the middle of page 639. Violence against an object is for the latter something alien only according to the second aspect. So this is a moment where it comes from outside. Power becomes violence when power and objective universality is identical with the nature of the object. Yet its determinateness or negativity is not the object's own immanent negative reflection according to which the object is a singular. So here's the problem, right? It's not universality that's driving this, it's singularity that's driving this. And when you have singularity battling with singularity, all they can do is dominate one another. That's the violence. That's what power, right? Power, we already know, mocked is the process of causation. It's universality particularizing itself into individuality. We're singularity. We already know that account. So he's saying here you don't have that. You have singularity battling with singularity to prove which one of them is really not universal. Kind of a strange battle, but that's exactly what they are. They're trying to prove their own singularity. I'm personalizing and caricaturing it, but that's to make the point, right? So the logical analysis here that's undergirding this is about the singularity being most fundamental and it trying to not be universal, but by not being universal, it's got to not be what you are, right? That the next mechanical object is. There's the violence. Does that help? Other comments about that or other things? Let me introduce chemism just very briefly, and then I put you through enough for today, so that'll be good enough. We've gotten pretty close to accomplishing everything I wanted to accomplish. There's some more here, but it gets pretty hairy pretty quickly. So, and he comes back to this Gestalt thing on 646. So we'll come back to that in later next time. So objects insofar as they are chemical now, same set of objects, same world, not a new place. We didn't leave, one domain and go to another domain, the mechanical world. We've left it behind. Now we're in the chemical world. Things are all different here. This is the same world, same set of objects, same set of processes, now in their chemical dimension. Objects, insofar as they are chemical, are not indifferent to their relations to one another. They're not indifferent to those relations. That define mechanisms we saw, it's not the case here. Rather, their relations, that in particular they are opposed to one another, are what make each object qua chemical what it is. So now that extrinsic relation that it defined by not defining monads, the singularity of monads and mechanical objects, is now turning out to matter. It's now definitive. It's becoming intrinsic. They are opposed or tensed and thereby primed to, here's the chemical language, to react to one another. They're primed to react to one another. So law here, we already introduced law and mechanism, right? Mechanism, law is just the centering, right? And that's all it is, that they all share this singularity dimension. Law, which is here he clearly says is particularizing itself out, universality particularizing itself out, communicates determinacy to each and every object. Objects qua chemical are not singular, they're particular. This is important to get, right? Mechanical objects, singulars, that can't stand in their singularity. That's ultimately what entails the move to chemism, where they're now particulars. But particulars, you always want to ask, of what, right? Because particularity always immediately, initially sounds like and is a feature of something else. It's either a feature of universality or it's a feature of singularity. Well, welcome to the problem in chemism, right? Every object is torn because it's a particular to stand on its own and to be universal at the same time. So every object now intrinsically is in contradiction with itself. It's both a singular, it's striving to be singular, to stand out on its own, and it's also universal. They're inherently contradictory, he says. This is on 646. Yeah, let's take a look at this we'll end with this for tonight. This will leave us with the process. And the process is where the nuts start happening. This is where the craziness ensues. So I'll just leave us with that for tonight. We'll come back to it next week and we'll spend our time working, trying to figure out how this process works. But here's what he says on 646, 149 in the German. First full paragraph down. On closer examination, he says, right, the chemical object is at first a self-subsistent totality in general, one reflected into itself and therefore distinct from its reflectedness outwards. And in different bases, he starts using chemical terminology, the base. The individual not yet determined as non-indifferent. The person too is in the first instance the basis of its kind, one that refers or relates only to itself. So far, so good. It looks like it stands on its own. So this is what, they were striving to be, the mechanical objects were striving to be this. Maybe the chemical objects get to be this. Not going to turn out that way. But the immanent determinist that constitutes the object's non-indifference is first reflected into itself in such a manner that this retraction of the relation outwards is only a formal abstract universality. The outwards reference, the outwards relation, is thus a determination of the object's immediacy and concrete existence. From this side, he says, the object does not return within it to individual totality. The negative unity has its two moments of opposition in two particular objects. It wants to stand on its own, but it can't. It's always two. It's always in relation. It always wants to be itself, and that looks like what it is, but it can't be that. It always has to have that, go back to our relational sense of mediation. It always has to have that in and through the other object. So chemical objects want to be singular, but they're particulars. So the best they can be is a particular against another particular. As he says, the negative unity has its two moments of opposition in two particular objects. Not singular objects, particular objects. Here's the problem, right? Whose particularity? Where does particularity belong? We know particularity doesn't exist unto itself. He says, accordingly, a chemical object is not comprehensible from itself, and the being of one object is the being of another. So chemical world, the chemical layer of the world is fundamentally a relational fabric. You don't get one without another. They all want to stand on their own, but they can't. They're particulars, they're not singulars. And even singularity entails, as we've seen. But then look at what he says. But second, so that's one side of it, right? There are singular particulars, or they're particularity. There's singularities that want to be singular, but turn out to be particulars, right? So they're at odds with one another. There's their tense relationship. But second, the determinateness is absolutely reflected into itself and is the concrete moment of the individual concept of the whole, which is the universal essence. What's that? Well, he says, it's the real genus of the particular objects. Now that's a ticking time bomb, right? When he's introduced genus in here, we know, hey, wait a minute. Universality is being thought of fundamentally differently here. It's not a shared feature. We had a kind of, specter of the subsumptive quantitative class conception of universality show up at the end of mechanism. But here, that's not the case. It's a genus that's at work here. It's the real genus of the particular object. So he says, second, just to restate that sentence, the determinist is absolutely reflected into itself and is the concrete moment of the individual concept of the whole, which is the universal essence. Essence talk, not singular objects, but essences now of these singular objects. All chemical objects are something. What are they? Well, they're expressions of the genus, chemical object. The real genus of the particular objects. He then says, the chemical object, which is thus the contradiction of its immediate positiveness, it's a particularity, and its immanent individual concept, it's being determined by the genus of universal essence, concrete universality. He says, because of that contradiction, each chemical object is a striving to sublate the immediate determinants of its existence and to give concrete existence to the objective totality of the concept. It wants to express, right? Each chemical object wants to express concrete universality that it already is. Wants to express that. Hence, it does still remain a non-self-subsistent object. It can't stand on its own. So that whole bit about it wants to be on its own, but it can't, still true. But in such a way that it is by nature in tension with this. Now notice, it was in tension initially with other objects, right? But now it's in tension with this lack of self-subsistence. This lack of self-subsistence, that it can't be what it is trying to be, self-subsistent. And initiates the process. The striving is a process. This process, he says, as a self-determining. How does that work? The next section's on the process, right? How does this chemical process work? We've looked at the mechanical process. The process is formal and real, communication and distribution. How's the chemical process to work? So we're going to come back next week, start with this, right? Move our way into teleology from here. The teleology chapter is, by comparison, easier, right, than this. This is the hardest part, in my view, of the objectivity chapters, trying to make sense of this account of the chemical process and how it necessitates the transition into teleology. There's this weird moment, I'll just point these out for you. where he says they come on 647 and 648. 649 and 650 are really the transition, but there he's really summing up things. He does it in the form of, you'll be glad to know, syllogisms, right, again. But here's what he says. So take a look at, he's talking about how the process is initiated, this chemical process is initiated, then how it's dissolved. And he says something outside the object steps into the object. What's the something? What's that? This negative unity, as he calls it. What's that? So then he says this crazy thing, right? Just to, mark out the crazies. Here's another one. This is on 648. Yeah, 648, the second full paragraph down. This disjunctive syllogism. Sorry. There he comes back to it, right? So he's telling you that this crazy thing he's just laid out in the previous paragraph, which is a description of how the process is initiated by the concept, how the genus particularizing itself gives rise to the singularity of chemical objects, and therefore mechanical objects. This disjunctive syllogism is the totality of chemism in which the same objective whole is exhibited as self-standing negative unity, then in the middle term as real unity, and finally as the chemical reality resolved into its abstract moments. In these moments, the determinant has not reached its immanent reflection in another, as in the neutral product, but it has in itself returned into its abstraction an originally determined element. It determines itself. It's self-determining. How in the world did that happen? How did we get from a world where there are objects that are singular, they're indifferent to one another mechanistically, now they're in tension with one another chemically? How do we get from that to a process that's initiated purely by the contradiction born within each one of those objects to somehow or another there's a process that's self-determining, right? Determines itself in relation to them, through them. It separates himself out from them in some way. This is the concept doing this. How does that enter in? This is where the concept to have been submerged, as he told us, right, is now arising out of that submersion and becoming free unto itself. So I want to see how that works. We'll talk about that next week. Yes? Good enough for me? Yep. Okay. I'll see you next week. Have a good rest of the week. Thank you for your patience.